celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We're most pleased to welcome to our program United States Senator Larry Craig. Our guest today has had a very long and successful history in politics in Idaho, representing the people of a district in Idaho in the state Senate for many years. And then in 1980, he was elected from the 1st Congressional District to the United States House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years. And then in 1990, he was elected to the United States Senate. And commencing next year, he will become the senior senator from Idaho. Our distinguished guest serves on the Agricultural Committee in the United States Senate, as well as the Energy and Natural Resources, and he's also a member of the Special Committee on Aging. As has been true in many past times on this program, Senator, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Tony, thank you. It's good to be back. It's great to be back on the campus here at North Idaho College, and thank you for inviting me to be a member of your program today.
Well, we certainly look forward to asking a number of questions on domestic and international issues. And I'm very pleased to welcome to the panel a regular panelist, Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and we're very happy to have as a visiting panel member today Mr. Rocky Owens, who's the President of the Associated Students at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Steve Shink to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Senator, I have to tell you that before the show I was drilling myself so I wouldn't fall back into old habits and refer to you as Congressman. After some time...
I wouldn't have minded that at all.
Well, after some time in the new position, would you take a few minutes to tell us a little bit about how you see the change? What are the differences between serving in the Senate and serving in the Congress?
Well, Steve, there's an amazing amount of difference. Frankly, it's difference that I didn't really knew existed, and I should have. I've been somewhat of a historian or a student of congressional activities, but the difference between being a member of the House and the Senate is divided in not just the 2-year, 6-year term, but in the level of authority and the rules that we operate under. In the Senate, you are much more considered an equal partner in the process, where party doesn't make as much difference in determining procedure or policy as it does in the House. That is partly the result of the very founding structure of the Senate itself, but it's also the difference in how you manage 435 distinct individuals versus 100 individuals. So put all of those things in combination, and the two bodies are distinctly different. We as citizens on the outside watching them say, well, they both handle legislation and they are the Congress collectively, and they reside just a few feet away on each different ends of the Capitol, but our founding fathers intended them to be very different, and they remain different today by that basic structure.
After your years of service in the House, do you find it an advantage? Certainly it has occurred to me in the past, thinking about your new role as Senator, that you're not quite the freshman that someone brand new to the Capitol would be. Do you find it as a real advantage to have worked as you did in the House before coming to the Senate?
Well, Steve, there is a real advantage there. It not only comes from the experience and understanding the people and the process, but in the Senate, because I had been able to know or get to know many of the senators before I was elected by working with them on different pieces of legislation. When I would pack my bills over from the House and go to a senator and say, I'd like to have you take a look at this. That helps us because in the Senate, it's the personal relationship, the one-on-one, the camaraderie, the collegiality that exists there, different from the House, that does make a difference, I think, in the final outcome of a piece of legislation. But also, I think, for Idaho's advantage, I was able to put a staff in place very quickly by moving staff I had from the House to those Senate positions. We came up and were running very rapidly, and there was very little lag time in the kinds of service that I think most citizens expect of their congressional or their Senate offices. That was to our advantage.
And here in the state, just before the show started, you mentioned that you now have the entire state of Idaho to cover as part of your responsibility. What extra pressure does that put on you?
Well, more time, or I should say less time spent in a given area like I used to. I was able usually for the last 10 years to be in Coeur d'Alene once a month, Lewiston, Moscow area once a month, Boise, Nampa, Caldwell once a month, but now, of course, because of the whole state and there are just so many hours in a day and so many days I can be away from Washington, that gets spread a little more thin. Now, as a result of that, and recognizing that that would be the case, I restructured the office and the way we represent the state in a different way that I think utilizes resource. Sandy Patano, who is here in Coeur d'Alene, who was a 5-county director, now is in charge of an entire region. We created regional advisory groups. I gave greater authority to staff in the regional offices so that they can have a more direct communication with the constituent. There is no central Idaho office in Boise anymore. The Coeur d'Alene office should be just as important to the citizens of this area as any other office, because it communicates directly with Washington, not just by phone or by telex, but by computer. And with those kinds of services, I think there is a more direct relationship that we can bring.
Rocky Horn.
Senator, I would like to ask you a question that's on the minds of many Americans today, and that is the healthcare crisis that we are facing. We are facing astronomical prices in healthcare, and they keep going up. The executive branch, President Bush, has proposed a plan, and my question is, what elements of this plan do you see that will work, and when will they be implemented?
First of all, Rocky, let me congratulate you on being student body president here at the college.
Thank you very much.
Once upon a time ago had that privilege down at the University of Idaho, and it's a valuable experience.
Thank you.
There's no doubt that health care is one of the top national issues and deserves to be. And the one thing that we shouldn't do this year is pass a national health plan. We should debate it. The American people and the citizens of Idaho must become involved in understanding what is and isn't in the current health programs of this country, and then look at all of the options that are being offered. And never in a political year should we pass something that will be as important long-term to this country as will be a new national program for health. Now, if you'll notice, I used program instead of plan, because I don't believe in the federalization, if you will, or creating a national health care system. I think it would be the worst thing we could do to our country. It is not serving the Canadians well when you begin to peel it back and look at it. It's not serving the Brits well, or the Germans or the Swedes as well as it should. It's a basic plan, but it does not treat the kind of expertise or talent that we expect coming from our health care system. Now, how do we address your question? Cost and accessibility, and how does the President's program fit? He is the only one to come forth with a program of the 3 major programs today who has suggested that his program will pay for itself. I think that's as important to decide how we're going to pay for it as it is who it's going to serve and how it's going to serve them and how are they going to access it. And so I applaud the President for doing that. The other 2 programs, the Play or Pay program that was offered by George Mitchell, the majority leader in the Senate, and the quasi-Canadian-style approach that Ted Kennedy and the major Democrat program is offering. It is estimated that they will cost $100 to $150 to $200 billion more a year than we're currently paying. But nobody offers how you pay. The President does. The President also does something by incorporating the private sector in the process. He is saying that the 37 million Americans that are uninsured today should be, and here's how you insure them. You voucher them, or you give them a direct tax credit so they can go buy a policy in the marketplace. And you make that policy portable, very important. Becomes like the Social Security card that you carry in your wallet. You have a health care program that you can move with you from employer to employer. And you do so by targeting those who cannot afford to pay, but recognizing that those who can should. You do it in the context of the current pay program. By that I mean the dollar amounts available. And you provide the voucher, you provide the tax credit. You do a couple of other things. You go in and modify Medicare and Medicaid to the extent that the insurance policy takes care of the Medicaid patient. Why? Medicaid, as it relates to cost containment, another feature that you mentioned in your question, will go the furthest in doing so, largely because when you take the 37 million Americans without insurance and they have no access, They wait till the last minute, until the care is so dramatically needed that they find themselves going into the emergency room. That drives the cost up 12 to 14% right there. The insurance program doesn't send them to the emergency room, it sends them through the doctor's door or through the clinic's door. So there in itself is a net savings. I think our President's program is a real program that it will pay for itself. Now, the reason I repeat again, it should not be decided in a political year. You heard Jay Rockefeller, Senator Rockefeller, standing on the floor the other day saying the President's program is a fraud. It is not a fraud to suggest you ought to pay for something that's currently costing the American system today, taxpayers collectively, about $800 billion. Key to anything is how do you pay for it?
Senator, another issue I know that you face, as all members of the Congress do, and we're all concerned about the economy of the country. And my question addresses several issues. One is the deficit, which I know you've always been concerned about as it's been growing, the unemployment rate in the country today, and then also what's happening, the whole issue of international trade and the question of competing with other countries such as Germany and Japan. Recent polls have indicated that that's probably the number one issue that's facing Americans in their concern today. With the package the President has submitted to Congress and others, as you've indicated, like with the health care, have submitted programs, I would like to give you this opportunity to share with your constituents what you think are some of the components that we should put in our economic recovery program.
Well, Tony, we ought to first of all put back in what we took out, or what I should say Congress took out. I opposed it in 1986 and in 1990 with the budget agreements. Those two agreements drove the economy to where it is today, into a recession, because we began to take away the components that invested in productivity in this country. We've got to get back to capital gains. It's not a rich person's game. The average wage earner in this country who's ready to retire and sell his or her home and do something else with that money is stuck with capital gains. It has been demagogued into a class attitude that is very dangerous to this country, and I hope we get away from that. We've also got to look at investment tax credit. In other words, you've got to put money where jobs will be created, productive jobs. Those are the kinds of things you have to do, number one. And our President's package represents that in part. We've got to do some other things. Address the deficit. In 1990, in that budget agreement that raised taxes and attempted to cap the deficit, it was very damaging to this country. We were doing it in the face of a predicted recession. Never has the Congress, since the Great Depression, ever raised taxes or destroyed economic growth incentives in the face of a recession. And this Congress did that. That's one of the reasons I strongly opposed it. And it drove the deficit from the $190 billion that it was to over $350 billion this year and a projected $400 billion next year. That's got to be adjusted, and then let's be realistic. The deficit is also a product of expenditure as much as it is a product of a decline in the rate of growth of revenue as a result of the recession. We're spending too many dollars, and that's being some are attempting to mask that over by saying, well, we'll take all of this money from the peace dividend in defense and put it over here on all these social programs. Well, Tony, in the decade of the 80s, as a conservative Republican, being an advocate of increased defense expenditures, and I think it was wise, it helped bring the wall down, and it helped fragment and destroy the communist regime of the Soviet Union and free those nations, and I think history will say we did the right thing in the 80s with what we did. But all while we were doing it, some of my liberal friends in Congress were blaming defense expenditure or blaming the deficit on defense expenditure. Now those same people are wanting to grab that money and put it over in social programs, and by the absence of their rhetoric, suggesting that if a deficit created by social expenditure is okay versus a deficit created by defense expenditure. Bottom line, deficits are all bad because they drive the economy, they create false platforms from which we operate, and we get the recessions we've had today. So what our President has proposed, I wish he'd have done it 12 months ago. There are those of us who encouraged him to do so. He didn't. Now he has. I think it's a responsive program. I hope we can meet his March 20th deadline.
And one final point in this area. You have access to so many people as the United States Senator. Are you optimistic about our international trade and whether or not we will be able to increase exports, for example, automobiles in those areas where, you know, one of the problems that's been in our economy, of course, is that we become such a service industry and we've lost so many jobs that were well paying, and like in your case, in your the state here, of mining or timber, or in the case of automobile industry.
Two issues with trade. We're still right in the middle of the Uruguay round of GATT in Geneva. Very key to Idaho agriculture as to the terms that will come out of that, not just for us to move in foreign markets, but to bring down some of the barriers that have existed collectively in the Western European continent, and with the coming up now of the European Economic Community and its efforts to shield some of its producers. I hope we can be successful in that round, and right now, at this very moment, in Geneva, those discussions are going on. I hope to go over next month, at least on agricultural issues, to see if we can deal with that. But let me talk about automobiles, because that is a false illusion that has been perpetrated by a dying United Auto Workers Union that just doesn't exist in reality anymore today. Half of the, quote, foreign cars that are moved in American markets today are manufactured in the continent of the United States, or in the North American continent, and a good many of them right here in the United States. It is a very international entity today. It just is easy for us to do a little bashing with the Japanese, because they are who they are. They are very tough traders, and we fought a war with them not long ago, at least in the memory of most Americans, and we beat them. And now Americans are frustrated because of the Japanese success. None of us look north to Canada, where on a per capita basis and by GNP basis, the deficit, our trade deficit with Canada, is 2.5 times higher than that of the Japanese. False premise, false argument. What isn't false, and what we've got to do, is, in my opinion, is forget the concept of free trade. It's a marvelous academic thing that ought to be debated only at round tables in a college cafeteria. Doesn't exist, never has existed. What must exist is fair trade. We are in an international market. We cannot ignore it. We cannot close our borders, and we shouldn't, because if we close ours, other nations will close theirs. Idaho last year traded about $1 billion worth of goods into foreign markets, substantial part of the Idaho economy. If we begin to shut down our borders, those goods will lose their homes that they're going to. And that's a very large portion of Idaho's agriculture and some component industries, electronics, now being a significant part of Idaho's economy. What I think we have to understand is where we are in time and place. And that is that we're in an international economy. We got to compete, but we got to argue that the table be level and that it be fair.
Thank you. Steve Shink.
Senator, the economy is on the top of everyone's agenda today, and I want to follow up a little bit on some of the things you've already mentioned. Earlier, you said that this is not the right year to pass a national health care package. It's a good year to discuss it, not the right year to pass it. Is an election year the right year to solve the economic problems that face this country? And this is the obvious other side of the question, can we afford to wait?
Steve, if you look at the President's package, and if we were able to implement it by March 20th, in all reality, we would not begin to feel the impact of it in the economy in time, if you will, to bail out the President if he were in trouble by then. I don't think that ever ought to be the intent of any economic package. The name of the game in town right now that will stimulate growth and economic movement by June or July of this next year are interest rates. They're already working their way through the system. Phenomenal percolation beginning to start as a result of a dramatic drop in interest rates, both short-term and long-term rates. And I think our President's very significant statement the other day as it relates to regulation. One of the great problems we have in this country today is the inability of banks to loan money out because of a very rough FDIC attitude that is a product of the savings and loan debacle of a couple of years ago. And so there's this harboring attitude that we've got to be extremely cautious, and that caution has blocked a lot of growth in the economy. And I hope that our President suggesting, not only suggesting, demanding that we back off from some of that regulation will stimulate that. But capital gains, investment tax credit, the ability of higher tax credits for families, and all of those types of things, those ought to be long-term economic goals, but past this year. I think it sends very important signals to the average citizen, the working men and women of this country, and to investors for purposes of infrastructure development, capital expansion for business and industry. All of that sends a message. We ought to clearly be looking at long term, not manipulating the economy for the sake of an election. That's never good politics, and it's rarely good economics.
Are we, however, in an election year going to be able to avoid that? Do you see a danger that as the next 8 months roll by, we're going to have a bidding war where each party throws out a new offer, raises the ante, gives something to another group in the hope that that bad economics though it may be, there'll be votes attached to it?
Well, you always run that risk, and you run that risk because of the nature of our system, and I don't know that you can avoid it. We are political, but we are a representative republic. There will be a good deal of pressure put on legislators by their local constituency to do something, or they'll sense that pressure. And in the art of legislating, let's face it, it's a two-party system. Thank goodness it's a two-party system. Republicans can't dictate, nor can Democrats, so there will be compromises made. What I've always tried to do is to say to Idahoans, here's what I believe, react to it, and then let's look at the price of what it will cost us. If George Mitchell says the price of getting a capital gains and an investment tax package is this, I have to judge whether that's an acceptable price or if he's asking too much. And he will ask it in the form of expenditure, in the form of programs, in the form of policy shifts, and you simply have to weigh it at the time. It's part of that, the game, if you will. Maybe that's a wrong word to use. It's part of what goes on in the process of creating public policy.
Rocky on.
Senator, we have watched in the last couple of years the Soviet Union evolve into a Commonwealth of independent states now, and there's been a new emphasis put on our defense. My question is, what role do you see SDI playing in all this? I know Boris Yeltsin has mentioned a joint venture in producing an SDI system, and when do you think such a system might be erected?
We have already, as a country, invested a good deal in SDI. Our president the other evening in the State of the Union once again emphasized its value as an umbrella of protection against small nations like Iraq that actually can put intercontinental ballistic missiles together under limited technology, and although they may not be accurate, they can certainly be devastating. I think it's too early to tell what kinds of cooperative ventures we will be able to establish with the Commonwealth of the former Soviet republics. But I do think it will be clearly to our advantage, along with the Europeans, to work with that group of nations, not only to show our willingness to cooperate, but to give them some stability as they struggle to form representative republics and representative forms of government. It's a whole new world out there. It happens to be a positive new world, but it's one that we can't predict very well yet. You know, even when you had two superpowers standing and using nuclear arms as a form of strategic deterrent, if you will, even though we didn't like it, it was a sense of stability. It was a sense of predictability. That doesn't exist today, and the adventure, at least, is to try to stabilize, and we have to be a player. I was extremely pleased this morning to see Jim Baker there to help lift off those planes going to the Soviet Union filled with aid. I think that's a cooperative effort that we've got to be a part of. I support SDI, and I'll continue to support it. We do need a strong defense system in this country, not a larger one, a pared down one, but it's got to be the best, and it's got to be strong and capable of performing to protect your freedom and mine. Just a year ago, we were involved in a war. That ought to be recognition of the fact that the world is not a safe world. That was a small nation that was able to create great instability in a region of the country.
Senator, I heard you make the comment, and as a political scientist, I've been so fascinated with what's happened in the world in the last 2 or 3 years. I think if you and I had been sitting here 3 years ago and predicted what happened, we probably both would have been maybe taken to an institution that we'd lost touch with reality.
I think you're right.
But what's happened in the Soviet Union and really the fall and collapse of communism in that country and the liberation of Eastern Europe, and then also the talks in the Middle East and with the United States playing an important role in that, I'm going to try to do a rather global question, that is, with these major changes and with certainly not an end to the threat to secure this country, but a tremendous reduction in that threat and what's going on, Could you just, in a very general way, describe for your constituents what you think this may mean for this country and other countries in international affairs in the near future?
Well, Tony, in the short term, there's this attitude, okay, George, you got it fixed out there, now come home and fix our problems here. That's quite typical of Americans. We tend to focus for very short periods of time. Well, that's been taken care of, let's move to this now. The external world has not been taken care of. There's all kinds of new relationships and new alliances that will have to be built as these nations stabilize and form. What's going on in Europe today is very fascinating to me. There is a new and growing fear, the emergence of a greater Germany again. And the Bundesbank is being the big guy on the street over there dictating interest rates as that country, that region of the world tries to form an economic unit known as the European Economic Community. Will that fall apart in the next 12 months as the French are extremely worried about the cheap labor coming in from Croatia or some place like that, like we worry about cheap labor coming in out of New Mexico or out of Mexico? All kinds of new dynamics that were not there a year and a half ago.
Could I just interject, also suggest to you, because I know you have, again, access to information, the whole question, too, of nuclear weapons in what was the Soviet Union and each republic.
Yeah.
If you would address that, are you optimistic they'll have to bring that under one command? I mean, and of course, there's the ethnic splits and diversity.
Well, you're right. There are so many of them. Yes, I am convinced that they can bring the nuclear weaponry and the disarmament into one command. But we got a problem there. In this country, we've got to deal with the whole question of denuking the world and what role we will play in helping them get there. As they lift these warheads off these missiles and destroy these missiles, what do you do with the warheads? Are we going to be a nation that says we will help you? Now, we have a lot of anti-nuclear people in this country who are ecstatic that we are denuking the world. At the same time, they're saying, but we won't touch that. That's nuclear waste. We don't want to be around that kind of thing. Collectively, as a country, we've got to deal with it. Or it may fall into the hands of a third world nation. It may fall into the hands of a Saddam Hussein, who knows how to use it and can make it a very damaging tool again, and a destabilizing tool.
I wish we had time to continue this. We always just get started. This has been so informative, and you have certainly indicated that there are a lot of problems internationally, even though there's some good news and that we do have to address those. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of our staff to invite you back at any time, Senator, to report to your constituents. And there are many issues we'd like to have gotten to, we didn't, but you're always welcome to come, and we appreciate you taking this time to be with us.
Thank you for the invitation. I'll be back.
Thank you.
All right.
I also express our appreciation to the panel, and Rocky, thank you for taking this time to represent the students at North Idaho College. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program. It's been most informative, and we will have the Senator back to report on other issues in the coming months. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we will discuss another subject we believe to be of significance to you and of interest to all of our viewers. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.